Hey everybody, it's Bradley Blankenship here again with another episode of The Source. March 20th of this year marked the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And to discuss this issue, we're actually having a very special guest on today. His name is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He's the former chief of staff of the former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. He's actually the man who was responsible for organizing the UN meeting with Colin Powell, where he presented what was deemed evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So we're going to touch on this topic. We're going to talk about the organization of this meeting to his best recollection. We're also going to be talking about some of his thoughts about current U.S. diplomacy, including the Nord Stream bombing, which we've talked about in previous episodes of this program. We are going to be talking about the U.S. current credibility of the U.S. diplomacy with regards to China. We're going to be talking about his thoughts of French President Emmanuel Macron's recent visit to China and his comments about Taiwan. And we're also going to be touching on the recent data leaks that came from the CIA, NSA, and other intelligence agencies in the U.S. that leaked sensitive information about the war in Ukraine, as well as evidence of the U.S. spying on key allies such as South Korea, Canada, and Israel. I think it's going to be a really special program, of course, having a high-level U.S. Bush administration official to this level to discuss these matters and more. And we're very excited to present this with you. So, Colonel, so I invited you on this program because I wanted to talk about the 20-year anniversary of the invasion of Iraq that took place on March 20th of this year. So that's 20 years after March 20th. I've seen your comments.
Could I ask a favor? Could I ask a
Sure.
favor?
Yeah.
Don't use the term anniversary. That's a happy, positive term.
All right. I won't use that. Okay.
The 20th year since the invasion.
The 20th year since the invasion of Iraq by the United States. Now, I have seen your comments in the media. You described, first of all, for the audience to know, you were the person who helped organize the UN speech by your boss, Colin Powell, who said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. So you were deeply involved in that situation. And as well, I think a lot of people don't know this. Colin Powell, to my knowledge, was the first and I believe the only Secretary of State to also be a part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So you were privy to a lot of military affairs as well as the diplomatic corps, of course. So I would like to get your just general take of the events leading up to the invasion of Iraq. I know that you've called it, the UN speech a hoax, and you called it a low point of your career, that you regret not resigning over that. But, if it's not too much to ask for you, I know that's probably a painful subject, but if you could just give us your best recollection of what led up to these events.
Surely. George Marshall was the equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then later Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. So you're right, but there was one predecessor to Powell, and George Marshall was very much a role model for Powell. More so than probably anyone else in the past, especially with a military record. The time leading up to the war with the Bush administration was truly a testing time, if you will, for both me and far more so for Powell. And I saw it firsthand as his chief of staff. It was a testing time because we were already battling the White House on a number of other key policy issues. From North Korea to global HIV/AIDS funding to China. Fortunately, the president sided with Powell more often than not on China, or we'd have a situation with China then like we have today, which is total bullshit. But we were really harassed by the vice president's office, by the National Security Council under Condi Rice, who was just a lackey for George Bush and Dick Cheney. She wanted to be Secretary of State so badly that she could taste it. And so she almost always took the side that she thought the president would be on, which in the first term was Cheney's side. So it was a torturous time. And when we got asked questions about the war, that is to say, running up to it, we were meeting with Hans Blix and others who were telling us more or less I think, accurate facts about Iraq. Hans Blix, for example, he's been a little different since then, but he was not as categorical with Powell. He said, put me back, and I will tell you with 95% plus assuredness that he has or doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. Just put me back in Iraq. And in November of 2002, I believe it was November the 8th, we got UN Security Council resolution, my memory serves, it was 1141 or something like that, that essentially put the inspectors back. And so we breathed a slight sigh of relief, thinking, well, the inspectors are going back and we're going to find out with surety whether or not there are WMD, which was increasingly the main point of the war, according to the White House. I've since learned there were many other points to the war, not least of which was discounted oil for Israel. And that's coming out in a book by Gary Vogler very shortly from now. He's in New York right now dealing with the publisher, probably May or June. So we were, shall I say, elated that we'd gotten this. Well, immediately, almost within 48 hours, the vice president goes out and gives a speech, which no one in the administration cleared, which essentially said the inspectors won't find anything because they'll be fooled by Saddam Hussein. It's no good to put the inspectors on the ground. Here's the vice president essentially violating the president's spoken policy, which was the inspectors are going back and we were going to listen to them. So that put a downer on it almost immediately, particularly when we hadn't seen the speech. But this was Cheney's practice. He did not show anyone. I don't even think he showed them to the president, his speeches, before he gave them. So we're trying to figure out what we're going to do at this point, how we're going to counter the vice president, which was part of our daily routine. And all of a sudden, Prime Minister Blair weighs in. I have to have a second resolution, one that explicitly authorizes the use of force, or I'm going to lose my vote potentially in a very, very majority Labor parliament. So that sounded preposterous, but he was very serious about it. He thought he was possibly going to lose that vote, which would have essentially taken him out of the coalition. And he didn't want out of the coalition. He wanted to be in it. So we're going to the UN to get a second resolution. We're a little bit confident about that until we encountered Dominique de Villepin, who was the foreign minister from France, as you'll recall. And Dominique let us know not only would France veto were we to go for a second resolution explicitly authorizing the use of force, Russia would too. So we had to call Dr. Rice and tell the administration to withdraw the amendment because we don't want to be embarrassed with two vetoes in the UN Security Council. So then we went on the defensive. Powell then sent me over to the White House to a meeting ostensibly to discuss in the White House with the key characters. Steve Hadley, the Deputy National Security Advisor, was in the chair of this meeting, how we would sell the war, if you will, were we to actually go to war, how we would manipulate the media, how we would do this, do that. At that meeting, I got a real close look at Douglas Feith, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, whom I'd already learned to not care very much for because he was working for the state of Israel. There was no question in my mind. His office was occupied by Mossad operatives almost 24/7. Donald Rumsfeld actually said, I don't run this building, meaning the Pentagon. AIPAC does. He was right, at least from Feith's perspective. So Feith jumps up and starts talking about how we have to make the war and the publicity, therefore, based on al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein's connections to al-Qaeda. Steve very gentlemanly told him to sit down and shut up, essentially. And we proceeded with the meeting, and then Feith jumps up again and starts talking about Saddam Hussein's connections with al-Qaeda, and if we don't include that, we won't have a very persuasive message. Hadley finally has to tell Doug to shut his mouth. I mean, Hadley's a gentleman and was reluctant to do that, but he finally had to tell him to be quiet. Well, in that meeting, I got a gleam of where we were going, and I went back and communicated it to Powell. I said, we're going to war. This wasn't a meeting to discuss if we go to war, how do we propagandize it. It was a meeting of what are the reasons we're going to war? And I saw it most prominently from the Secretary of Defense's office through Feith. So then the next 2 days went by with us kind of concerned about what we were going to do. And all of a sudden, third day or so after that meeting, he walks into my office and plops down on my desk a 48-page script, I would find, as I counted the pages. And he says to me, we've got to go to the UN and present the case for Iraq's failure to disarm. That's the way he phrased it. And that indeed was the title of the paper. I said, when? He said, well, 4th or 5th of February. I said, impossible. We can't get this ready for the 4th or 5th of February. As I thumbed through the document, I saw it was not an intelligence document. It was more like a lawyer's brief. And I later learned it had been written by John Hanna and Scooter Libby in the vice president's office, both lawyers. So I said, I don't know that we can do this. And he said, you're probably right. We need more time. I'll call Condi. Well, I thought I had a sigh of relief there. He went back in his office. He came back a few minutes later. He says, Condi says the president has already made the message public, and therefore we can't walk it back. We have to do it. Turned around, walked back in his office. I sat there and thought for a few moments. And just from the challenge of the technical dimensions of what we had to do, he'd done this to me before. He'd given me things that were almost impossible to do technically, logistically. And I somehow had managed with a lot of good people to get them done. But I said, this is it. This is the last straw. I'm getting out of here. I'm resigning. Had nothing to do philosophically, really. It was just, I was tired of being challenged to do these impossible tasks at the last minute. So I called my wife and I said, I'm resigning. I'd already typed out my resignation letter to the president. And she talked me out of it and told me essentially, he'll have no one to protect his rear and his flanks if you leave. So you need to stay there. He's a good man, etc. So I put it in my center desk drawer. Well, he then came back into the office later that afternoon and said I'd have Will Toby from the National Security Council and I'd have John Hanna from the vice president's office joining me when I went to the CIA to make preparations. Well, 2 spies. Okay, I knew they were spies. I could take care of that. I made my first mistake then. I said, I want to take Carl Ford with me. No, Carl Ford was our intelligence expert at the State Department. I know what Carl thinks, so I don't need you to take him. I'll take Tom Finger, his assistant, who was even better than Carl, especially on Iraq. He said, no, I know what they think. They belong to me. I can talk to them anytime. You don't need to take them. I should have, because they were intelligence professionals and they'd have been able to challenge George Tenet in areas where I couldn't because I didn't have the intelligence expertise. In any event, we went out there and we put it together. We hardly slept. 7 days and 7 nights. We took it to New York and did a dress rehearsal in the US-UN mission cafeteria on the top floor. That's the first time Powell got to go through the entire thing without a break. And we both knew and had gone through some torture up to that point that it was all circumstantial and that the most powerful element in it was Saddam Hussein's connection with Al Qaeda, particularly for an American audience. And here's a vignette that'll tell you how we got to that. Midway through the preparations at the CIA, Powell grew very angry one day, and for the first time in our then 14-year relationship, he actually grabbed me, as we say in the military, by the stacking swivel and forced me into a room in the National Intelligence Council spaces, sat me down in a chair and said, "We're alone in here, right?" And I said, "Well, boss, it is the CIA." He didn't even laugh. He didn't even smile. He just said, "I am sick and tired of the crap in my presentation about torture and about terror and about Saddam Hussein's connections with terror. I don't buy any of it." I think he thought I was going to object. I looked at him and I said, "Good, we'll take it all out. I think it stinks too. And it's just circumstantial. It's not even that. It's terrible. It's not good intelligence." He looked at me and he said, "Okay, do it." And we took it all out. Well, when I went to tell the speechwriter, Lynn Davidson, who was at the computer preparing the presentation, to take it all out, she looked at me and said, "Okay, I'll get busy doing it." I didn't notice my second mistake, John McLaughlin, George Tenet's deputy, leaning against the door jamb. He had heard everything I said to Lynn, and he disappeared. Later, we're in the DCI's conference room, the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet's conference room, and we're resuming, at that point, a fairly rudimentary rehearsal with Powell. And George gets up and leaves. Well, that was a no-no. I had told him the Secretary of State's directions were that every time he was there, Powell, Tenet would be in the room and not leave, but be there the entire time. Well, he left. So I'm angry and trying to figure out how to express it. And Tenet's gone for about 15 minutes. I'm about ready to get up and go get him. He comes back in, sits down beside the secretary, and this is a direct quote. These words will never leave my mind. Mr. Secretary, we've just learned from interrogations of a high-level al-Qaeda operative of significant contacts between the Mukhabarat, the secret police of Saddam Hussein, and al-Qaeda operatives, including the use of chemical and biological weapons, unquote. Secretary turned to me and said, LW, put it back in. And I had to go back and tell Lynn, put all the connections with terrorism back in. This was so bad that at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where I was staying the night before the presentation in New York, 2 a.m. in the morning, presentation would be at 9. I'm at the computer deleting things in that category because after the dress rehearsal, Powell had told me it's too long, get rid of some stuff. I said, the torture stuff or the terror stuff, right? He said, that'd be a good place. So I'm in the room and I'm taking stuff out, me personally at the computer, and I'm taking stuff out. Phil Mudd, who was the counterterrorism czar from CIA, George Tenet's man, walks into the room, comes up behind me and says, what are you doing? I told him, and he said, you can't do that. You're not an intelligence professional. You can't do that. I said, watch me, and went back to the computer and continued my work. Well, he left. The next morning on the floor of the Security Council, about a half an hour before Powell's presentation, George Tenet comes up, puts his arm around me in that smarmy way he had of doing, leans into me and says, I understand you were cutting the presentation last night. I said, yep, sure was. He told me it was too long and I cut. And he looked at me like he was going to chew me out. And then finally he smiled and said, well, it won't matter. And he took his seat behind Powell at the UN. Another indicator of Powell's angst at this point. He had told George at the end of the presentation in the cafeteria, the dress rehearsal, you stand behind every word in this presentation, right, George? And Tenet had said, Mr. Secretary, I do, and I'm more worried about my oversight committees in the Congress if something isn't right than I am anything else. Powell said, good, because you will be sitting behind me in camera tomorrow during the presentation. And Powell had orchestrated that. And that was an unheard of thing for a director of the Central Intelligence Agency to be so public on television. But that's where George is. If you look at the video today, you see him just above the Secretary's right shoulder with Kim Holmes, our Assistant Secretary for International Operations and such. So that's how we got there. And both of us afterwards, as we listened to Tenet and McLaughlin tell us on the telephone and elsewhere, over the next 4 months, all the way up to August, tell us that the pillars of his presentation were falling down. We both grew more and more angry, so angry that by the time we get to May of 2004 and the reports on Abu Ghraib and torture and such, me and the secretary are rarely talking. And when we get to January 2005, after the re-election of George Bush and contemplating the elections in Iraq and so forth, Powell has not yet been told that he's got to resign. We're not talking to each other. And when we do, it's purely professional. It's not friendly. It's antagonistic. It's even to the point of where we avoid each other by the time we get to the end.
I think that story is really interesting because a lot of people don't understand that the US government is so complex and there's so many different agencies and departments that are competing against each other for different objectives, clout, and so on. And I had a conversation with my congressman. I grew up in Northern Kentucky. His name's Thomas Massey. I'm sure you know him. I asked him, I think it was about 2013, and I had been writing a lot about the war in Syria, and I asked him, Congressman, are you aware that there are CIA-backed forces in Syria that backing the Free Syrian Army fighting against Pentagon-backed Kurdish forces in northern Syria right now? This had not really been a story at the time, but it was something that I had contacts that were telling me about this, and he said, "Yeah, that's what's happening. We literally are fighting against ourselves. The Pentagon versus the CIA. They have clashing objectives. One of them wants to take out Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The other one wants to fight ISIS." I think that what you've just said is quite an interesting picture of that there is indeed always this kind of struggle for power within the U.S. government, and that the U.S. government isn't really actually a monolith. It's not a bunch of people who agree with each other, just talking to each other about things they agree about all the time, but it's this constant clash of power. Given what you said, though, I want to just ask you straight up, because you have said before that that you helped sell a hoax to the American people, and what you told me about how you're going to propagandize the war and so on. Some Bush administration officials have said that the evidence presented to the UN was not a lie, but it was information that maybe wasn't the best, but that people were confident in it. Do you think that it was a lie? That is to say, do you think that there was kind of malicious intent there by some actors, or do you think that genuinely people just got it wrong?
Let me give you two examples, concrete examples that I think will answer your question. The first is the one I began to describe to you about Saddam's contacts with Al Qaeda, arguably the most powerful part of his presentation for Americans. What we discovered by August of that year, 4 months roughly after the presentation, was that the information that Tenet gave Powell, as if it were hot off the presses, was months old, that it had been gained from Sheikh al-Libi, that it had been gained through the most vicious torture by our acolytes in Cairo, who tortured for us, as did Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. Different relationship then with Bashar al-Assad. He was perhaps one of the best sources of our information initially after 9/11 on Al Qaeda. That information had been gained through torture, vicious torture, that Sheikh al-Libi had dissented afterwards, about 2 weeks afterwards, that he had actually made a formal statement that he would have said anything to stop the torture, and that our own Defense Intelligence Agency had put a burn notice out on that intelligence. When I would inquire in some anger of George Tenet why we weren't alerted to that burn notice, he said it was a computer glitch. Second incident is the incident of the mobile biological labs, which I found George Tenet to be an ardent believer in himself, so much so that Powell had to call him in August and tell him his website, CIA website, the unclassified, or I guess it was at secret level, so we could see it at state, was still showing pictures of the biological labs as if they were in fact biological labs, and they weren't. They were helium balloon fillers, hydrogen, helium, whatever, for artillery practice, and to take them down, by God. And Tenet was apologetic and did subsequently take them down. But here's what I found out about them. Not only was it a single source, and Powell's specific direction to Tenet in my presence and my reinforcement of it over the 7 days and nights we were out there was multiple sources for every significant piece of intelligence. And George asked, what did that mean to Powell? And he said 3 or 4 different sources from different intelligence gathering means, which means human intelligence, mass-int, materials intelligence, SIGINT, signals intelligence, and so forth, all corroborating independently the thing you're telling me. And Tenet agreed to that. Well, the only thing the mobile biological labs were based on, we were told 4 sources, and we were given explicit information about those sources. The other 3 were false. The only source was Curveball, we found out later. We didn't even know that name then. Curveball was an agent being run by the BND, the CIA's equivalent in Germany, whom the BND didn't even trust. And so when I talked to Tyler Drumheller, who was director of CIA operations for Europe afterwards, he said, I warned John McLaughlin and I warned George Tenet that Powell shouldn't say anything based on this guy. He was a fabricator. He was a liar. Even the BND didn't trust him. Oh, wow. Whom did you talk to again? John McLaughlin and George Tenet. John McLaughlin said back to me, the train's gone down the road too far now. We can't change it now. Those were outright lies, and they knew they were lies. I suspect there was a great deal more that they knew was not the truth.
Circumstantial, and the circumstantial evidence that was allegedly corroborated was gained via torture, which most people understand. Torture is not really a reliable form of information. You can get people to say whatever you want. You know, if you're torturing them so brutally, they will say whatever you want to get them to stop. So, like you said,
And
it sounds like it's just
you can talk
sorry.
to experts like Ali Soufan, FBI at the time, who was probably the only really excellent interrogator we had in the American government. Most Americans are absolutely ignorant of the fact that we only had 11 interrogators in the entire government complex who were trustworthy, had done it before, were professional, and knew how to do it. Ollie was the best of them all. They were all in the FBI.
Mm.
There were none at CIA. So when Tenet was given the mission, he had to create interrogators. Yes, he had to create them out of whole cloth. That's one of the reasons they had such a problem with torture. But I saw everything Powell saw. I saw everything the president saw in that regard in terms of CIA produced intelligence. I never saw a single piece of actionable intelligence that proved productive that was gained from high value detainees who were tortured under the president's direction.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned this before, the issue of China in the Bush administration's approach, which is obviously much more moderate than what we see from Trump and Biden and so on, escalating this, what people are calling a new Cold War with China. I want to ask you about this story that emerged right after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It was reported widely in the American media that the American intelligence and high-level diplomats had informed China of their intelligence about the military buildup outside of Ukraine. And according to these reports, the Chinese did not believe the Americans. And to me, it seems from what you've told me with Iraq, the situation, and thinking about Blinken's presentation to the UN, talking about the upcoming invasion of Ukraine, it seems like a classic case of the boy who cried wolf, doesn't it? To you, I mean, doesn't it seem like the U.S. It damaged its credibility through the invasion of Iraq and subsequent other lies that we've seen?
Well, I have no way of corroborating what you just said about China.
Yeah.
I've heard the stories, but
Mm-hmm.
most of my contacts in the Central Party School and elsewhere in the Chinese government, other than Wang Yi himself, who I probably couldn't get a note out of, I don't really, I have no way of corroborating that. But to your point, one of the things I said repeatedly in 2000 and late 2005 and 6 is that who the hell will believe us ever again?
Right.
And I also said very explicitly about China and found it to be true in my role as a diplomat that every time we talked to them, our first talking point was human rights and Taiwan and such. And their first talking point was Taiwan and not human rights. I said, their first talking point now is going to be, you guys torture and you guys lie. So why should we believe anything you say or take any of your advice? And that's going to be the thing around the world. Why should
That is the talking point now. I can tell you, I'm familiar with Chinese media, and that's what they talk about all the time.
Yeah, I said, it's a disaster what we've done, and I wasn't as concerned about the Chinese as I was about our own friends and allies, because I have subsequently found out that it's true to a degree about them. They dare not speak it sometimes because they still are very much impacted, particularly by our banking system and such. So they don't want to be alienated to the extent that they're suffering like some 2 billion people in the world in 35 countries, and we have under draconian sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're intimidated. It's like the intelligence business. One of the things I discovered was that when France weighed in, when Germany weighed in, when Sweden weighed in, when Denmark weighed in, when Japan weighed in, Israel, of course, weighed in, and confirmed what Powell presented at the UN, it was not necessarily, in the case of the Europeans, it definitely was not, their intelligence apparatus confirming it. It was those whom George Tenet cherry-picked from that apparatus to get to say that France agreed or that Germany agreed. And the reason
Right.
he found people like that was because they did not want to endanger the very one-sided relationship they had with the United States in terms of national technical means. And by that, I mean the National Security Agency, the CIA in terms of its technical ability with satellites and so forth. We were sharing that many times with allies and friends, and they felt they would jeopardize that if they didn't be forthcoming with us when we wanted affirmation of something. And so you could always find someone. We found a French lab, for example, and I personally went to the director of that lab that had spun the so-called centrifuges that were in question with regard to a nuclear program in Iraq to 98,000 RPM without visible deterioration for more than 45 minutes. Well, that means they can't possibly be rocket shielding or mortar shielding. That means they are, in fact, the kind of metal you need for centrifuges to enrich uranium. So that was a very convincing thing for me to find that individual. But that individual was provided to me by none other than George Tenet. And I'm sure that that was the one person in the French intelligence community, maybe there were more, that he found that would confirm what he wanted confirmed.
You another question, and I know that you were not in office when this happened, obviously, but given your experience with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the State Department and so on, the Nord Stream bombings. What's your take on that? I mean, do you think that the United States had the capability? I mean, I think we all certainly can see that the United States has the motive to have committed that attack on Nord Stream. But do you think the U.S. actually has the capability or the will to do something like that, as Seymour Hersh reported very in detail in his report?
As I've said publicly elsewhere, and we'll say again here, I think the odds are 90% plus that the United States did it.
And why? What do you base that on?
Because, first of all, they had the capability, and I know well that capability, having worked in several areas where that capability was briefed and we thought we might use it. And they're very professional, and they're very closed mouth. They're not like the special forces in general who talk like sieves. And we are the only, if you think hard about it, we're the only one who had the strategic rationale for doing it. And had the allies, in this case, particularly the Chancellor of Germany, who would be, shall I say, timid enough to go along with it once it was pretty apparent to him that we'd done it.
That's and right. He met with Biden right afterwards.
Yeah, that's saying something too, because I've talked with Der Linke Bundestag members, others who've told me that one, the price of gas has gone up by 9 to 10 times. The quality of the gas is really dirty, whereas Nord Stream was pretty clean because it's coming mainly from fracking in the Permian Basin. And that 60% of Germans, if polled, will tell you that they are sick and tired of the whole situation, and it's growing in that sense. So,
well, I live in Europe. I can tell you my own personal experience. My gas bill last year was about $300. Now it's $1,000. Actually, $1,200. So quadruple for the whole year. And I actually got an air conditioner installed, an electric air conditioner, which should have brought my bill down, but it quadrupled still.
Yeah,
we're seeing massive inflation. You're actually Czech Republic. We have 16% inflation year on year so far. It's gone down a little bit, but it's still at 16%. Groceries are skyrocketing, and I'm seeing it in my own pocket here. I mean, there's many people that are really, really angry about what's going on. There, in September in Prague, there was tens of thousands of people in the street demanding that their country leave NATO and change their entire foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think that's I think this Nord Stream thing is very relevant to Europeans, and I really appreciate you being so, giving us so much candor about your opinion on that, because I know that's a really sensitive topic right now. I know the U.S. is in total damage control about the Seymour Hersh story. We're seeing the New York Times. They had their own theory about some kind of Ukrainian Bond villain who did this. We talked about this actually in another episode of our show with some people. They have some Ukrainian Bond villain who apparently did it with a private capacity using a yacht with explosives that are very hard to obtain, apparently.
I said on one show, when someone brought that up to me, I said, if Bill Burns put that story out at the U.S. CIA, I've lost a lot of respect for Bill because that story just
Do you know him? Do you know Bill Burns?
Oh yes, he's probably the finest diplomat, the only diplomat in the U.S. government today. Why he's the director of the CIA is beyond me. Other than I think Joe Biden's scared of the CIA, and he felt if he put Bill there, not only would he get the unvarnished truth with regard to any intelligence developed in the bowels of the building, which is pretty good usually before the policymakers get it and taint it. And he would also get a man who would speak truth to power, because that's Bill. Bill's the one, remember, who, when he was ambassador in Moscow, sent the message back and said, when the Russians say "niet," they mean "niet."
Yeah, that's true. I have a lot of Russian friends, and I can definitely attest to that one. So there's been another development here in Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron was recently in China, and he met with President Xi Jinping. And on his return flight back to Europe, he told Politico that he thinks that the Europeans should not be America followers. They should not join in a potential war in Taiwan. And I just saw reported today that the EU Council President, Charles Michel, also is warming up to what French President Emmanuel Macron said. And apparently other leaders in Europe are going that way. They want Europe to become a third superpower. They want to have what they call strategic autonomy. What's your reaction to that, to what the French president said, and to the general direction it seems Europe is going now?
About 7 months ago, not too long after the invasion, 24 February, I said, be careful what you wish for, as we were talking about Norway, Finland, Sweden, and such, and going to 32 countries in NATO. This euphoria will not last. We are going to sever the transatlantic link. And I recalled a conversation that Powell and I had at Forces Command in Atlanta in 1989 when I first joined him. And I was a lieutenant colonel, and I dare not be too upstanding. But Powell said to me, Larry, the whole transatlantic link is going to disintegrate. Mitterrand, Thatcher, Major, Kohl will be gone. There will be no European leaders with their feet in World War II, as it were. That's when the transatlantic link will sever, and NATO will be no longer an alliance. And then we went on with business. That was just a comment he made. I've never forgotten it. And I think he was right. And I think we are exacerbating that right now to the point where it's going to happen very, very suddenly rather than over time. We're going to see the exact opposite of the euphoria we had with this 32 nation expansion of NATO. And it's going to be because of this war and because of what we're doing, because Europeans are understanding that one of the purposes of our support for Ukraine, in addition to making billions of dollars for the defense contractors, is to reestablish our economic and security hegemony over Europe. That's part of the reason we're doing it. And and Germany's going to lead this pack, I think. Maybe France too.
That's the whole idea of NATO, though, right? Keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, and
Yes.
keep the Germans down.
Yes. And you can tweak that a little bit, and you've got the same thing today, I think. It's just an unsustainable alliance. I told Powell when we started the out-of-area operations mantra as a reason for post-Soviet Union NATO that it was bullshit. I said, there's no way you're going to apply Article 5, which is the essence of NATO, to going abroad into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, wherever. But we did. Nonsense, strategic nonsense, political nonsense, and yet we did it. It's not going to work.
Now, what is your just general take right now on the state of U.S.-China relations? You know, you said that the Bush administration had a moderate policy towards China. You know, they helped China join the World Trade Organization, and that was a really huge boon for the Chinese economy. And they've seen massive growth since then. And it's been pretty much a win-win relationship for China and the United States ever since then. And even going back before then, when China, the People's Republic of China, reestablished diplomatic ties with the United States under Nixon. we can see that it's been a pretty healthy partnership. But now, ever since, well, I think maybe you can even argue going back to the Obama administration with his pivot to Asia, now we're seeing a lot of friction. And what do you make of that shift in that dynamic from when you were in office to the present state?
George Bush was a smart man in some respects, George W. Bush. Um, George Bush once opined that if we couldn't be a strategic competitor with China in the very realm we had established in the world, he didn't say predatory capitalism, but that's what he was talking about, then we should be ashamed and retreat from the battlefield. And I think that was behind his support, even over Cheney's remonstrances to the contrary. Cheney wanted a new Cold War, so did Rumsfeld. And they wanted to use Taiwan to get it, and they were encouraging Chen Shui-bian, the leader in Taipei at that time, to go for an independence referendum, which was a red line with Beijing, and they let us know that explicitly. So Bush was on Powell's side, and Americans don't realize this, but Powell was very much instrumental with the president's help in keeping the relationship on an even keel throughout the 4 years, and it lasted, I think, through Condi. I have no idea why we suddenly decided, Richard Haas, my old boss, is an example, to say strategic clarity, because strategic ambiguity isn't working. Well, when you say strategic clarity, you mean you're prepared to defend Taiwan, because the Taiwans are not going to do it. Not really, not successfully. And you can't do it either. So this is a recipe for absolute disaster. It's a recipe for nuclear war, because when we lose so badly, we will go nuclear.
I saw a recent poll of Taiwan residents by Academia Sinica, and it found that 59% of Taiwan residents think that the United States is not trustworthy. They don't believe that the U.S. would actually send troops to defend their island if there was a war over reunification with the mainland.
We'd be insane to, frankly speaking.
So you don't think it's going to happen? You don't think that the U.S. would send troops to Taiwan?
Well, I'm not going to say that, because this administration and the administration before it were absolutely insane with regard to China. This administration is the same way, absolutely insane with regard to China. The idea, as Bush said, George W. Bush, the idea that we can't compete with China in predatory capitalism across the globe. We have the banking system, we have the transactional, the reserve currency. They're fast eating away at that. But we have all those advantages. That's one reason Macron said what he said, probably. Charles de Gaulle once said the most pernicious weapon wielded by the United States of America is the dollar. He was right. All of that being the case, I think still, the idea that we can't compete with China on a battlefield that we prepared is utterly preposterous. But that's what we're saying. We're saying you are going to beat us if we allow you to go on in the way we've allowed you to go on in the past. Therefore, we're going to find ways to defeat you otherwise. And one of them is Taiwan.
I think that's something that a lot of Americans especially don't understand. And there's this idea now that Biden says it a lot, that we have to defend the rules-based international order. Well, the thing is that China, under the current status quo that has existed of neoliberalism and so on, this has benefited China so immensely. I mean, their opening up and reform policies has absolutely been a boon for China and the Chinese people. The status quo, the predictable and orderly relations of the international security structure and global economics, it benefits China. So to upset that actually is not in Beijing's interest. And that's why, for example, I've argued in the past that I don't think that, for example, a lot of people are saying that China wants to send weapons to Russia to fight the war in Ukraine. And I just don't see that, because China has tens of billions of dollars of tangible assets in Ukraine. It owns hundreds of thousands of hectares of Ukrainian land. It has a free trade agreement with Ukraine. It's just not in their interest to escalate the conflict, and they want to end it. So, the thing is that the United States seems to be the one to actually upend the playing field that they themselves made under the deal of globalization. That's why they're adopting trade protectionist policies. They want to ban TikTok, blah, blah, you name it. Do you share that opinion, or what do you think?
I do. I think Ukraine was going to be the European entrepot for the Base Road Initiative. I think that was Chinese design. They've got
exactly. Zelensky himself said that he told in a phone call with Xi Jinping that he wanted Ukraine to be the bridge between East and West. Ukraine is part of the Belt and Road Initiative.
That's the reason I think that we're saying under the table, and not so much under the table anymore, to the Germans that they have to sever their trade relationship with China. What are we saying to the Australians with this submarine deal? But we want you to sever your trade relationship with the most powerful trading partner you have. It's nonsense. And yet a Labour government in Canberra is going along with it. And it's going to cost them billions more dollars than the conventional submarines they'd have bought from France would have cost them, which would have done the job for them. They don't need these submarines. This is a way to get around ITAR and a way to share technology with the so-called Five Eyes that we haven't done in the past. And it's an attempt to get our allies to build ships for us because we can't get our own Congress to do it. It's nonsense.
That's right.
And so is this China business. I think it's nonsense. And it's going to lead to, I'm afraid, more so than Ukraine, far more so than Ukraine, it's going to lead to a nuclear exchange.
You mentioned for example, the example of Australia and how they're going along with the U.S. war against China, especially the trade war. And a lot of people don't know this, but the U.S. has actually been profiting on the back end. So, for example, when the former government, the Morrison government in Australia was pushing the lab leak conspiracy of COVID-19, China just stopped buying Australian coal, and the U.S. stepped in, started selling more. Right. Now there's kind of this embargo against Australian beef and wine. The Americans are selling more beef and wine to China. So at the same time that they're telling their allies not to do business with China or stoke some kind of trade war, they're actually profiting on the back end. Kind of on the same subject of screwing over allies, I want to ask you about the recent data leaks that come out of top U.S. intelligence agencies like the CIA and the NSA. Not only was there extremely sensitive information about Ukraine's upcoming spring offensive, which is quite damaging to both Kiev and Washington, and now we can see that they're in complete damage control, and most of the American media is not even reporting on these leaks because they're so sensitive and so of such a strategic value to Moscow. But another part of that revealed that the U.S. has been actively spying on and wiretapping its allies like Canada, Israel, and South Korea. And in fact, on April 26th, so this month, in a few weeks, the president of South Korea is going to be meeting with President Joe Biden under the context of him knowing that Washington was wiretapping his national security office, the top strategic defense planner of his country. What do you make of this leak that shows that the U.S. has been spying on its key partners? And the key points that they were spying on had to do with Ukraine. For example, they wanted to know whether or not South Korea was going to supply Ukraine's with weapons. They did so through Poland. So Poland was sending their weapons, and South Korea is replenishing the stocks. They're also we're now buying artillery rounds from South Korea. So we were spying on the Koreans to see if they would be basically to the hilt with us in Ukraine. There was apparently a lot of infighting in Korea about this. Some people thought, in fact, that there might be some kind of idea of a quid pro quo for this state visit if the Koreans went along with it. What do you think about the U.S. spying on its own allies?
This is nothing new. Nothing new at all. I mean, during my administration, they spied on Colin Powell when he found out that the NSA had transcripts of his telephone calls with Sergei Lavrov, for example. He essentially called him up and said, "This is something you do routinely? You really spying on your own cabinet officers?" Oh, yes, of course. And we had the brouhaha with Germany, where we were listening to German conversations at the highest level. We even had the brouhaha with the UN. We were listening to the UN Security Council deliberations in secret. This is nothing new. We do this all the time. We've been doing it for years. In fact, my research shows we've been doing it since at least 1945. And as we got more and more sophisticated at the NSA, we did it more. These programs that Edward Snowden revealed are not just used against Americans. We use them against everyone. So that's nothing new. Second, it's one of the reasons, I think, and this has been building over time, why if you look at very sophisticated polling, and some of that's done by my own army, because they call it preparation of the battlefield. They want to sense people's views that their territory might be once or twice or three times contested, and the U.S. Army might have to go out and do something. So they do these sophisticated polls in places like Pakistan, South Korea, you name it. And we're finding that the majority of those populations, usually a small majority of all of them, but a very large majority, sometimes 60, 70% of those under 40, think the greatest threat to the future of their lives is the United States of America. So this is nothing new. We have Cheney once said, better to be feared than loved. Well, he meant it. He even meant better to be feared than respected. Fear is what you want to build in the world against your power. That's what saves you at the end of the day. We seem to operate on that principle today. And as you indicated with regard to our predatory capitalistic practices, we seem to use that to make profits out of it too. This is nothing new. And by the way, back to your first statements, I've made nothing like an exhaustive search as I did with the WikiLeaks papers, for example. But what I sense in what has been leaked is that it was purposefully done so.
And yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that. Now, it seems like because of this leak that there's fractures within the U.S. intelligence community or within the U.S. government about the existing Ukraine policy.
Yes, that plus, if you really want to think about how you would establish the very most effective ground for negotiations for a ceasefire, and then hopefully followed by a peace agreement, I don't think we're going to get that. I think we're going to get a ceasefire, and then we're going to get Kashmir. We're going to get Cyprus. We're going to get Korea. In other words, 75, 100 years, we're going to have to patrol that demilitarized zone or whatever it turns out to be. But we will get a ceasefire, I think. And these leaks are sort of tailored to undermine everybody who might have objections to that in some way, and including ourselves.
Hey everybody, if you like this content, please smash that like button. Consider giving it a share. Please subscribe. It's just one button to press. And also, if you feel so inclined, please subscribe to our Patreon to support the page. Anything is appreciated. And we thank you so much for viewing this. And we'll get back to you next week. Thanks a lot.